Grace's heart stopped the moment she heard the child's screams echoing from the garden, high-pitched, desperate, terrified, and, when she rounded the hedge and saw 6-year-old Emma standing frozen beneath the old oak tree, arms outstretched in panic as hundreds of bees swarmed from the disturbed hive above her, she didn't think, didn't hesitate, just ran. The image that would haunt Grace forever was not the bees, but the look in Emma's wide blue eyes, not surprise, but resignation, as if the little girl had already learned that no one would come for her. Grace threw her cardigan over Emma's head and scooped her into her arms, running toward the fountain as stings burned her neck and hands, plunging them both into the cool water as the insects dispersed, holding the trembling child against her chest as Emma sobbed not from pain, but from something deeper, something that had been breaking inside her for months. "You're safe now, baby," Grace whispered, her own tears mixing with the fountain water. "I've got you. I've got you." It had been 3 months since Grace took the position as housekeeper in the Whitmore mansion. 3 months since she'd first seen little Emma sitting alone at the grand dining table, pushing food around her plate while her father, Mr. James Whitmore, tech mogul, millionaire, perpetually distracted, talked on his phone, and her stepmother, the elegant and cold Victoria, sipped wine and scrolled through her tablet, neither of them looking at the child who so desperately wanted to be seen. Grace had needed this job after losing her husband to cancer 2 years ago, and her own daughter, Maya, to a car accident just 6 months later. She'd been drowning in grief and medical debt, barely surviving in her small apartment, when the employment agency called about a live-in position at an estate in Woodland Hills. She'd expected to clean and cook and fade into the background of a wealthy family's life, but she hadn't expected Emma, sweet, quiet Emma, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes, who drew pictures alone in her room, who said please and thank you in a whisper, who flinched when Victoria raised her voice, who had learned to make herself invisible. The beehive had been hanging from the oak tree for weeks. Grace had mentioned it twice to Victoria, explaining it was dangerous, that it should be removed professionally, especially since Emma played in that part of the garden. Victoria had waved her off both times with barely concealed irritation. "The gardener will handle it eventually, Grace. Stop bothering me with trivial matters." But the gardener had been let go the month before another. Victoria's budget cuts that didn't actually affect the budget, but seemed designed to make the staff's lives harder. What Grace didn't know until later, what would make her blood run cold when she pieced it together, was that Victoria had seen Emma heading toward that tree, had watched from the upstairs window as the curious child reached for the lowest branch, had turned away and closed the curtain. Not murder, perhaps, but something just as dark, indifference to whether the child lived or suffered. After Grace pulled Emma from the fountain, she carried the shaking girl to her own small room behind the kitchen, the one place in the mansion that felt warm, that smelled like the lavender sachets Grace made herself, that had photos of Maya on the dresser and hand-sewn quilts on the bed. She carefully removed a few stings, applied baking soda paste, wrapped Emma in a soft blanket, and held her until the sobbing stopped, until the little girl's breathing slowed, until she whispered, "Why doesn't Daddy look at me anymore? Why doesn't he love me like he used to?" Grace's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, because she knew this pain, had seen it in Maya's eyes when her father was dying, that fear that love could disappear, that you could become invisible to the people who were supposed to see you most. "Your daddy loves you so much, sweetheart," Grace said, smoothing Emma's damp hair. "Sometimes grown-ups get lost in their own worlds, in their work and their worries, and they forget to show love the way they should, but that doesn't mean the love isn't there." Emma looked up at her with those impossibly blue eyes and asked, "Will you stay with me tonight?" "I'm scared," and Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and they fell asleep together on the narrow bed, Grace's arms wrapped protectively around a child, who wasn't hers, but who was filling some of the hollow spaces Maya had left behind. The next morning, Victoria found them there, and her face twisted with something ugly, not concern for Emma's bee stings, but fury at the intimacy she discovered, at the bond forming between her stepdaughter and the help. "This is completely inappropriate," Victoria hissed, pulling Emma roughly from the bed, ignoring the girl's wince of pain. "Emma has her own room, her own bed, and Grace. You are not her mother, you are staff. Do you understand the boundary you've crossed?" But before Grace could respond, Emma did something she'd never done before. She pulled away from Victoria and ran back to Grace, wrapping her small arms around Grace's waist, pressing her face against Grace's stomach, and said in a voice stronger than anyone had heard from her in months, "Grace saved me. She's the only one who cares if I'm hurt. She's the only one who sees me." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and Victoria's face went pale, then red, and she grabbed Emma's arm hard enough to leave marks, not hitting, never quite hitting, but the grip of someone who ruled through intimidation and control. "Your father will hear about this," Victoria said, directing her venom at Grace, "about your attempt to turn his daughter against me, about your inappropriate attachment, about your complete lack of professional boundaries," and she dragged Emma from the room, leaving Grace standing there trembling, not with fear for her job, but with the terrible knowledge that she'd made Emma's life harder by loving her, by showing her that someone could care. For 3 days, Emma was kept away from Grace. Victoria suddenly took interest in the child, driving her to playdates that didn't exist, keeping her upstairs during meals, instructing her in a voice dripping with false sweetness that Grace is very busy with her work. "Darling, we mustn't bother the staff with our problems." Grace watched from the windows, from doorways, catching glimpses of Emma's pale face, seeing the light dimming in those blue eyes again, and she felt helpless in a way she hadn't since watching Maya's casket lower into the ground. But Emma was braver than anyone knew. On the 4th night, she crept down to Grace's room after Victoria had gone to sleep and James had left for a business trip to Tokyo, and she crawled into Grace's bed and whispered, "Tell me about Maya," because Grace had shared, in a moment of connection, about the daughter she'd lost, and Emma understood loss to her mother had died in childbirth, and though she couldn't remember her, she felt the absence like a phantom limb. Grace held Emma close and told her about Maya's laugh, about how she'd loved painting and would get colors all over herself, about how she'd made up songs about their cat and insisted on wearing mismatched socks because matching is boring. Mama and Emma listened with a hunger that broke Grace's heart, because this child was so starved for stories, for connection, for the simple intimacy of being seen and known. "Do you think," Emma whispered, "that Maya and my mama are together in heaven, being friends?" And Grace, who had struggled with faith since her losses, found herself saying yes, found herself believing it in that moment, found herself understanding that this child, this beautiful, broken, brave little girl, was a gift, not a replacement for Maya, but a second chance to love, to mother, to matter. They fell into a secret routine. Emma would sneak down 3 or 4 nights a week, and Grace would read to her, braid her hair, listen to her worries, help her with the art projects she was too scared to show Victoria, teach her to make cookies and sew simple stitches, and tend to the small herb garden Grace had planted behind the garage. During the days, they maintained careful distance, but their eyes would meet across rooms, and they'd exchange small smiles. A secret language of love in a house that had too little of it. Grace began keeping a journal of concerning things she noticed. The way Victoria spoke to Emma when she thought no one was listening, cutting comments about the child being needy and dull, and nothing like your father. Unfortunately, the fact that Emma's mother's photos had been removed from the main rooms and stored in the attic, the expensive toys that were bought for appearance but never played with, the way James, on the rare evenings he was home, would reach for Emma, but Victoria would intercept, redirecting his attention, keeping father and daughter just slightly apart, a master manipulator playing a long game. The turning point came on Emma's 7th birthday. Grace had assumed there would be a party, something grand and showy, as fit the Whitmore name. But the day arrived and there was nothing, no decorations, no cake, no celebration. When Grace carefully asked Victoria about it, the woman waved her off. James is in Singapore, and Emma doesn't have real friends anyway. No point in throwing a party for appearances when he's not here to see it. But Grace saw the devastation on Emma's face when she came down for breakfast and realized everyone had forgotten. Saw the way the little girl's shoulders curled inward. Saw her trying not to cry, trying to be invisible again. And Grace made a decision that would change everything. That afternoon, while Victoria was at her salon appointment, Grace transformed the kitchen into a wonderland. She baked a 3-layer chocolate cake with Emma's help, hung streamers made from colorful paper, set up an art station with canvases and paints, made Emma's favorite foods, invited the only 2 other staff members, Carlos, the gardener who'd been rehired, and Marie, the part-time assistant hand. They celebrated Emma with a joy and authenticity the mansion had never seen. Grace had bought a small gift with her own limited money, a locket with a photo of Emma's birth mother on one side and a photo of Maya on the other, so our girls can be together and you can carry them with you. Emma had cried, but happy tears this time, and she'd hugged Grace so tight and whispered, "I wish you were my real mom," and Grace had whispered back, "I wish that too, sweetheart. You are the most special girl in the world." They were so lost in celebration, in laughter and frosting-covered faces, and the pure joy of a child being loved, that none of them heard Victoria return early, didn't know she was there until they heard the sharp intake of breath, turned to see her standing in the doorway with her phone raised, recording, her face a mask of calculated fury. "This," Victoria said coldly, "is everything James needs to see. Proof that you've been undermining me, turning his daughter against me, overstepping every boundary, playing house with a child that isn't yours." Grace stood, instinctively moving between Victoria and Emma, and said with a calmness she didn't feel, "I'm loving a child who deserves to be celebrated on her birthday. Something you should have done." Victoria's smile was ice. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Pack your things and be out in an hour. And if you try to contact Emma, I will pursue legal action for harassment." Emma screamed, a sound of pure anguish, and ran to Grace, holding on with desperate strength, crying, "No, no, no, don't make her leave. Please, I'll be good. I'll be better. Just don't take Grace away." And in that moment, Carlos stepped forward, his phone also raised, and said quietly, "I've been recording too, Mrs. Whitmore. Recording for weeks, actually, every cruel comment. Every time you've isolated this child, every time you've kept her from her father, and I think Mr. Whitmore would be very interested in seeing all of it." The color drained from Victoria's face. Marie nodded and added, "I have photos too, of the bruises on Emma's arm from when you grabbed her, of the empty room on her birthday before we decorated, time-stamped and dated. We've been documenting because we were worried, because someone needed to protect this little girl." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like eternity until Grace said firmly, "I'm calling Mr. Whitmore right now, and we're all going to wait here together until he can video call. And Emma is going to tell him herself how she's been feeling, and we're going to show him everything, and he's going to decide." For the first time since Grace had known her, Victoria looked afraid, and Grace understood that the woman's power had only ever existed in shadow, in the spaces where James wasn't looking, in the silence of a child too scared to speak. The video call with James started tense. He was irritated at being interrupted during a crucial meeting, but within 5 minutes, as he listened to Emma's trembling voice tell him about being lonely, about missing him, about being scared of Victoria, about the beehive and the forgotten birthday, and the nights she cried herself to sleep, His face transformed from annoyance to devastation to rage. "Put Victoria on," he said, his voice deadly quiet. And when Victoria tried to explain, tried to paint Grace as a manipulative interloper, he cut her off. "I'm looking at the videos Carlos just sent me. I'm listening to audio that breaks my heart. I'm seeing my daughter's face and realizing I've been blind and absent, and I've failed the one person I should have protected above all else." He told Victoria to pack her things, told his lawyer, who he called immediately, to begin divorce proceedings, told Victoria she would leave the house that night, and any attempt to contest would result in every video, every photo, every recording being made public. Victoria left within 2 hours, her mask finally cracking to show the bitterness beneath. And the mansion felt different immediately, as if something toxic had been aired out. James came home early, taking the company jet back overnight. And when he walked through the door the next morning, Emma ran to him but then stopped, uncertain, conditioned to hold back, until he dropped to his knees and opened his arms and said, "I'm so sorry, baby girl. Daddy's been lost. But I'm here now. I see you now, and I will never stop seeing you again." They held each other and cried, and Grace stood back, ready to give them space, ready to accept that her part in this story might be ending now, that father and daughter were reunited. But Emma reached out a hand to her and said, "Grace too. She's part of us now." And James looked at Grace with tears streaming down his face and said, "I don't know how to thank you for saving my daughter, for being what I wasn't, for loving her when I was too blind to show her I did." In the weeks that followed, the mansion transformed. James cut back his travel, started working from home 3 days a week, had breakfast with Emma every morning, put her to bed every night, listened to her stories, and looked at her art, and learned about the little girl he'd been missing while she was right in front of him. He asked Grace to stay, not as a housekeeper, but as a family manager, and, more importantly, as a permanent part of Emma's life, giving her a salary that would erase her debts, and a suite of rooms on the second floor, and complete freedom to help raise Emma in the way she'd been doing in secret. Grace and Emma planted a garden together in memory of Maya and Emma's mother, 2 women who'd never met, but who had created the connection between a grieving mother and a lonely child. Emma started therapy to work through the trauma of Victoria's emotional manipulation, and she bloomed like the flowers in their garden, laughing more, speaking up, making friends at school, creating art that exploded with color and joy. James started therapy too, working through his grief over his first wife's death and recognizing how he'd buried himself in work rather than facing the pain, how Victoria had exploited that absence, how close he'd come to losing his daughter. One evening, 6 months after Victoria left, the 3 of them sat together in the garden between Grace and James on the bench. "Fireflies beginning to light up the dusk hand," Emma said. "I think Mama sent Grace to us, don't you think? Like she knew we needed her, and she sent an angel." James looked at Grace, this woman who'd given his daughter back to him, who'd shown him what love in action looked like, who'd risked everything for a child that wasn't biologically hers. And he said, "I think you're right, sweetheart. I think we've been blessed." Grace thought about the darkness she'd walked through, losing her husband and daughter, the grief that had almost consumed her, the job she'd taken just to survive, and how, in the ashes of her loss, she'd found purpose, found love, found a second chance at motherhood. And she understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means letting the broken spaces fill with new light. Emma fell asleep between them as the stars came out, and Grace and James carried her inside together, tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and stood for a moment watching her peaceful face. This child who'd brought them both back to life? "She talks about legally adopting you as her mother," James said quietly as they walked downstairs. "Making it official, making sure you can never be taken from her. I hope that's not too much." "I hope," Grace interrupted, tears in her eyes. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." A year later, the adoption was finalized, and Emma stood between her 2 parents, her father who'd found his way back, and her mother who'd chosen her in a courthouse filled with flowers and joy. And when the judge declared Grace officially Emma's legal mother, the little girl whooped with happiness and threw her arms around Grace and said, "Now you're my mama forever. It's real. You can't go anywhere." And Grace held her daughter because Emma was her daughter in every way that mattered and promised. Forever and always, baby, you are loved. You are seen, you are cherished, and nothing will ever change that. They went home together. This family forged, not by blood but by choice, by courage, by a child's scream that brought a grieving woman running, by a love that refused to stay silent in the face of cruelty. And in the mansion that had once felt cold and empty, there was laughter and light, and the sound of a little girl singing while she painted, knowing she was safe, knowing she was loved, knowing she was home.